接下来呢，这位教授是一个非常神奇的教授。那我们常说术业有专攻，那这位嘉宾呢，恰恰正好是相反，他可能是法学界做电影制片做得最好的，而在电影制片界学法律学得最好的美国教授。他的部分作品被惠特尼美国艺术博物馆永久收藏，他就是知识产权界的大咖，来自美国肯塔基大学法学教授、电影制片人 Frye 教授。下面掌声欢迎。
When I was asked to come to Jilin University to teach a class on United States intellectual property law, I was also asked to propose a TED Talk on the theme Extrema. And I was intrigued because I had never heard the term before and had absolutely no clue what it meant. But I eventually learned that extremum is a term for the maximum or minimum value of a mathematical function within a particular range. So some functions lack an extremum, other functions have only one extremum, and a few have many or even thousands. Well, that got me thinking, right? I'm no mathematician, but I know a good metaphor when I see one. And the concept of extremum is a great metaphor for my favorite topic, innovation, right? But maybe not in the way that you think, okay? So if we think of a function as what we already know, and an extremum as the limit of what we know, then maybe we can conceive of innovation as everything beyond an extremum, right? Anything new. Well, what should that metaphor suggest to us about the nature of innovation and how we ought to design innovation policy? You might assume that it suggests that we should subsidize innovation as much as we possibly can, right? After all, innovation is what enables us to grow our society, to make us rich, to improve our quality of life. We love innovation. We want as much of it as possible. But I'm not so sure, right? I'm not so sure. After all, an extremum is just the value of a function at any particular point. So our metaphor suggests that innovation is any value beyond an extremum, anything new. So that could be something really far outside an extremum, a major innovation, right? But it could also be just barely outside, a very minor innovation. Maybe one we don't even notice, maybe one we don't actually value all that much. Our metaphor can't distinguish between the two. But we can. We can, and we do, right? When we actually think about innovation in the concrete, not in the abstract, we don't just ask whether something is innovative, we ask how innovative it is, and we ask whether it's actually valuable, right? Unfortunately, that kind of discrimination between valuable and trivial innovation is something that innovation policy often doesn't do very well. So I want to ask if maybe there's a way we can make innovation policy do that a little bit better, right? So in the United States, we subsidize innovation in two primary ways, right? Grants and intellectual property. So the government, charitable organizations, they make grants to potential innovators in order to encourage them to invest in innovation. And the amount of grant money that an innovator receives typically depends on the grantor's expectations about the likely value of the innovations that person is likely to produce. The problem is information costs, right? It's hard for grant makers to know which innovators are going to produce valuable innovations and which ones are going to produce worthless innovations or maybe no innovations at all, right? So by contrast, intellectual property subsidizes innovation by giving innovators themselves a monopoly of a certain kind on the innovations that they create for a limited period of time that they can either use themselves or sell to someone else, right? So in theory, this creates an incentive for people to invest in innovation. And it has the advantage of requiring individual innovators to take the risk of failure rather than the government or a private grant maker. So in theory, intellectual property is justified because the benefit of all that additional innovation exceeds the cost of granting the intellectual property rights. But in practice, we have no idea whether that's actually true, right? Sometimes it probably is, but often it seems wildly implausible, right? Especially when the so-called innovation in question isn't really an innovation at all. So part of the problem is that our intellectual property system grants rights without considering the value of an innovation at all. In fact, in many cases, it doesn't even consider whether the people receiving those rights actually wanted them in the first place, whether it made any difference to them at all with respect to their decision to innovate to get those rights, right? And the problem is that the ideology, the ideas surrounding innovation discourage people from asking whether intellectual property is actually achieving what it's supposed to accomplish, whether it's actually working, and most importantly, how it can be improved, right? So for example, patents are supposed to encourage innovators by giving them exclusive rights in their inventions. And in theory, only novel, useful, and non-obvious inventions are patentable. But in practice, the United States Patent Office routinely grants totally absurd patents. For example, it has issued a patent, back to the slide. It has issued a patent on a pet toy shaped like a stick, right? A utterly conventional method for patching drywall, and one of my favorites, shared with my class earlier this week, a method of exercising a cat using a laser pointer, right? In fact, a 5-year-old boy even obtained a patent on a method of swinging a swing side to side or in an oval, right? All extremely valuable innovations we're glad we've enriched the world with. Of course, these ridiculous patents are just an artifact of the formality and bureaucracy of the patent system, right? Well, patent doctrine is supposed to ensure that patents that it issues are actually valid. The formal requirements often ignore common sense, and what's more, as a practical matter, it's just really hard for the patent office to reject a persistent applicant. But the bigger problem is the vast number of incredibly weak patents issued by the patent office that could never actually be litigated but still have settlement value, right? Patent litigation is expensive, especially for patent defendants, and so as a consequence, many are happy to settle even frivolous claims so long as settling is cheaper than litigating. Right? So for example, for many years, the patent office routinely issued patents for inventions that consisted of identifying some common industry practice and then disclosing that it just so happened you could do that thing on a computer, like everything else we do today. And while the Supreme Court eventually put an end to that practice, holding that these on a computer patents were actually not patentable in the first place, they were clogging up the patent system for a really long time, costing a lot of people a lot of money that was just being wasted. right? And the Patent Office continues to issue many weak, obviously invalid patents of this kind, right? So, for example, even though a patent is entitled to a presumption of validity when it is litigated, about 40% of litigated patents are actually invalidated by the courts. And to make it worse, right, only relatively strong patents ever get litigated in the first place. So the very worst, the very weakest patents, the owners would never litigate them at all, right? They're just there to clog up the system and cost people money. Okay? Well, there's a similar problem with design patents. So in theory, design patents create exclusive rights in new ornamental designs, but in practice, they require neither novelty nor ornamentality, right? The Patent Office routinely issues design patents on familiar, obviously functional designs, primarily because it essentially isn't allowed to do otherwise. So here you can see a patent issued to Apple for a bag, right? And you can also see a design patent issued on a recyclable aluminum drinking glass, perhaps a familiar shaped object there. Or, for example, a handheld fan, right? Here's another highly innovative design. As Saul Waxler might have said, you could make the Patent Office issue a design patent on a ham sandwich. In fact, maybe someone already has. And in any case, somebody has received a design patent on a slice of deep dish pizza, of all things. All right, so all this might seem trivial until you realize that the ongoing multi-billion-dollar Apple v. Samsung litigation hinges primarily on several of Apple's design patents on the shape of a cell phone case covering rounded corners and the placement of the home button, right? These design elements were neither new nor ornamental, purely functional, and in any case, Samsung didn't copy them in the first place. In a sane design patent system, Apple's design patents would never have issued in the first place, and they certainly wouldn't be enforceable. Right? But in the system we have, what we get is two giant companies wasting vast sums of money in litigation, billions and billions of dollars being flushed down the toilet, right? The problems with copyright are slightly different, but equally grave, and were caused primarily by reforms, or we better say changes, to the United States copyright system in the 1970s. Previously, copyright required registration before publication and lasted for a fixed term of years. Afterward, it attached automatically to all works of authorship as soon as they were created, and lasted for the life of the author plus an additional 70 years, tantamount to forever, right? So, consequence of that is we can see the term of United States copyrights getting longer and longer and longer over time, with no indication that in most cases these copyright grants were in any way relevant to people's decision to create works of authorship, right? And in addition, the breadth of the system is just absurd, right? The United States copyright system grants a copyright to every work of authorship, no matter how trivial, right? So every email you write, every WeChat status update you post, every snapshot you take on your cell phone is protected by copyright, even though you probably didn't realize it in the first place. It's just another huge clog on our system that doesn't make any sense at all. And extending the term of copyright has had the unfortunate effect of accomplishing exactly the opposite of what we wanted it to, right? The idea behind granting copyright protection was that it would encourage authors to make their works available to the public, but exactly the opposite has taken place because the overwhelming majority of published works have little or no market value. And as a consequence, the authors or owners of those works have no incentive to make them available to the public, and no one else can either because they're tied up in the copyright system. So you can see here that the number of works available from the turn of the century when copyright starts hitting them is dramatically lower than the number of works that are available from previous periods of time, right? So we can actually see copyright actively impoverishing cultural discourse in the United States by making it harder for people to get access to works of authorship, right? Well, so what's the lesson, right? Is a lesson that we should eliminate intellectual property, right? That it never works? No, right? Of course not. Sometimes it does work. Often it does work, right? Patents do encourage innovation in design. Copyrights do encourage the creation of new works of authorship, right? Few people would invest in the creation of new medicines if they couldn't get a patent. Few people would create blockbuster films if they couldn't get a copyright, but not every invention is an expensive new medicine. And not every work of authorship is a blockbuster film, right? In fact, only a tiny fraction are. Why design an intellectual property system for exceptional inventions and unusual works of authorship and then apply it to everything? It just doesn't make sense. So often, when policymakers talk about intellectual property, they say it should be stronger, right? As if more intellectual property rights just means more innovation. I think that's wrong, right? Sometimes increasing the scope and duration of intellectual property rights increases innovation, but often it doesn't, right? Importantly, it's an empirical question about whether it's going to or not, and you can't answer that question in the abstract. The goal of intellectual property reform should be to make intellectual property rights more efficient, not just stronger. Sometimes that might mean making them stronger, but other times it might mean making them weaker or eliminating them entirely, and we should be open to either possibility, even though we typically currently aren't. Right? Well, what does that mean in practice? I think China has an opportunity, a golden opportunity right now, to become a leader in innovation policy, right? It's already adopted many new and innovative intellectual property laws and institutions, and is in a position, a unique position, to develop those laws and institutions in a way that will benefit the nation and its people as much as possible, right? Other countries, I can think of one big one in particular, want to push their laws and institutions onto countries like China, right? But in many cases, those laws and institutions are broken and inefficient, right? So while it's important to be open to suggestions, it's also important to evaluate the wisdom of those suggestions. Right? The best innovation policy isn't the one that creates the most intellectual property rights, but the one that creates the most efficient intellectual property rights. The intellectual property rights that work to accomplish what they're supposed to. That's a challenging goal, but I think it's one worth pursuing. Thanks.
Professor Brin, thank you for your brilliant speech. Inspired me a lot. 同样，接下来呢是我们的提问环节。
Is there anyone who would like to raise a question? Or please feel free to raise a question if you like. In Chinese or in English is all both okay. All right, the boy in blue shirt, thank you.
What do you think of the Chinese innovation policy? I think that I can download anything from the internet, but the writer's rights will be insulted, but it's just convenient to me. What do you think about this situation?
Do you mean that 你是不是想说在网上很多东西都可以随意
对，就是中国现在是创新非常发达，但是就是能从网上下载到我任何想要的资料，但是另一方面就是对作者来说就是非常不公平的。
Like Chinese has a very good trend of innovation, but you can download anything what you want from internet without paying any fee, and this is very unfair to the author or to the one who invented it. So what do you think of it?
Yeah, I think it's great that you can download things and it's cheap and it's easy and it gives you access to as much information as possible. I think the internet is fantastic. And I think people should suck it up and deal with the fact that that's how people get information today. I guess I'm not terribly sympathetic to claims about fairness. You know, as long as people are still producing works of authorship, then they got as much as they needed in order to produce those works in the first place. And that's what copyright is for. That's what patent law is for. It's not to give a special benefit to inventors or to authors, right? The goal of patent law, the goal of copyright law isn't to reward people, right? It's to encourage them to do something that we think is gonna benefit all of us, right? And so as long as they're getting enough to encourage them to produce works of authorship or invest in innovation, I think it's a mistake to give them any more. In fact, I think it's kind of wrong. Right? It's a waste of public money, it's a waste of public resources. It just means things are more expensive for you. And I don't agree with that.
Thank you for your answer. Next is our lottery time. Okay? Let's name rolling, and you can call the start and call the stop.
Start.